December 19th, 1944. In a stone farmhouse outside Verdun, Supreme Allied Commander Dwight Eisenhower stared at a map covered in red pins, each one marking a German breakthrough. To the north, 12,000 American paratroopers were surrounded in Bastogne, cut off, freezing, running out of ammunition. The Germans believed they would surrender within days. They believed the Allies would need weeks to respond. Then Eisenhower turned to George S. Patton. "How soon can the Third Army attack north?" Patton's answer came without hesitation. 48 hours. The room fell silent. To disengage an entire army, wheel 90 degrees, and drive 100 miles through a blizzard into enemy territory. It had never been done. But what happened next shocked the world. In 72 hours, Patton moved over 100,000 men and 16,000 vehicles through winter hell when his tanks smashed into Bastogne on December 26th, breaking siege. Eisenhower spoke 3 words. Patton did it. This is the story of how one general's impossible promise saved the 101st Airborne and changed the war forever. December 19th, 1944. The Ardennes forest. Snow fell like ash over the broken earth of Belgium, muffling the sound of distant artillery into a low, rhythmic thunder. The air tasted of iron and pine resin. In a stone-walled farmhouse outside Verdun, beneath the flicker of kerosene lamps, Supreme Allied Commander Dwight David Eisenhower stood before a map dotted with red pins, each one marking a German breakthrough. His jaw was set, his eyes tracing the bulge that had split the Allied lines, like a wound. Around him the room hummed with tension, generals in damp wool coats, officers with mud-caked boots, the acrid smell of wet cigarettes. Outside, the Meuse River ran cold and black beneath the winter sky, and somewhere to the north, encircled by 3 German divisions, the 101st Airborne Division clung to a town called Bastogne like a fist refusing to open. The Germans called it Wacht am Rhein, the Watch on the Rhine. The Allies would come to know it as the Battle of the Bulge, the largest and bloodiest single battle fought by American forces in World War II. It began in the pre-dawn darkness of December 16th, when 250,000 German soldiers, supported by nearly 1,000 tanks and assault guns, smashed through the thinly held American lines in the Ardennes. The forest, deemed impassable by Allied intelligence, became a highway for panzer columns. Within 72 hours, the German spearhead had driven 50 miles into Allied territory, creating a bulge in the front that threatened to cleave the British and American armies in two and recapture the vital port of Antwerp. It was Hitler's final gamble in the West, a desperate bid to reverse the tide of a war already slipping through his fingers. But in the chaos of that winter offensive, one piece of ground mattered more than any other. Bastogne, a crossroads town of 4,000 souls in southern Belgium, where 7 paved roads converged like the spokes of a wheel. Whoever held Bastogne controlled the movement of armies. And so the Americans dug in, and the Germans surrounded them, and the fate of the Western Front hung in the balance. The 101st Airborne had been resting in Reims when the call came. They had jumped into Normandy on D-Day, fought through the hedgerows of France, and dropped into the Netherlands during Operation Market Garden. Now, battered and under strength, they were ordered north into Belgium with only a few hours' notice. Many went without winter gear. Some rode into battle in open trucks, rifles clutched in frozen hands, watching the horizon for the first flash of enemy fire. By the time they reached Bastogne, on December 19th, the town was already nearly surrounded. The Germans came at them from 3 sides, Panzer Lehr to the west, the 26th Volksgrenadier Division to the east, and elements of the 2nd Panzer Division probing from the north. The airborne troopers, fewer than 12,000 strong, faced more than 45,000 German soldiers, and the weather closed in. Fog, snow, clouds so thick that Allied aircraft could not fly. The men of the 101st were alone. General Anthony McAuliffe commanded the defense. A soft-spoken artillery officer with a square face and steady eyes, he had little time for drama. On December 22nd, when the German commander sent a written ultimatum demanding surrender, warning that refusal would result in total annihilation, McAuliffe's reply was a single word: nuts! It was a piece of American defiance that would echo through history, absurd and unyielding in equal measure. But behind the bravado, the situation was grim. Ammunition was running low. Medical supplies were nearly exhausted. The wounded lay in makeshift aid stations with no morphine and little hope of evacuation. Food was rationed to 1 meal a day, often nothing more than a can of cold beans shared among 3 men. And still the Germans came, probing the perimeter, launching assaults against the foxholes dug into frozen ground. The troopers held. They held because there was nothing else to do, because surrender was unthinkable, because every hour they bought was an hour closer to relief, but relief was not guaranteed. At the Verdun Conference on December 19th, Eisenhower had gathered his senior commanders to assess the crisis. The room was a study in contrasts. British Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, ever cautious, urged a strategic withdrawal to consolidate forces. General Omar Bradley, whose 12th Army Group had borne the brunt of the German assault, argued for a counteroffensive from the south. And then there was George S. Patton. Lean and wolfish, his face tanned even in winter, he wore his trademark ivory-handled Rurino revolvers and expression of barely restrained aggression. Patton's Third Army was engaged 100 miles to the south, driving toward the Siegfried Line. To disengage, wheel 90 degrees north, and attack into the teeth of the German bulge would require a logistical miracle, a movement of men and machines on a scale rarely attempted in modern warfare. Eisenhower turned to him and asked how soon the Third Army could be ready. Patton's answer was immediate. 48 hours. The room fell silent. Some thought it a bluff. Others thought it madness. Eisenhower's eyes never left Patton's face. When can you start? Patton leaned forward. On December 22nd, 3 divisions. What the German High Command expected in those frigid days before Christmas was paralysis. They believed the Allies, surprised and off balance, would need weeks to regroup. They believed the Americans, inexperienced and soft, would crack under sustained pressure. They believed Bastogne, isolated and besieged, would fall within days. These were not unreasonable assumptions. The Germans had studied the campaigns and soirées of 1940. When their blitzkrieg shattered the French army in 6 weeks, they remembered the chaos of encirclements, the collapse of morale, the speed with which modern armies could disintegrate. And they underestimated the machinery of American logistics, the vast humming engine of supply and coordination that stretched back across the Atlantic to the factories of Detroit and Pittsburgh. What they could not foresee was Patton. By the evening of December 19th, even before Eisenhower gave the formal order, Patton's staff officers were already drafting movement plans. The Third Army's operations officer, Colonel Halley Maddox, worked through the night with a skeleton crew, charting routes, calculating fuel consumption, coordinating with supply depots. The task was staggering. 3 divisions, the 4th Armored, the 26th Infantry, and the 84th Infantry, amounting to more than 100,000 men, plus tanks, artillery, trucks, and supporting units. They had to disengage from their current positions without alerting the Germans, turn north across icy roads, and attack toward Bastogne through enemy-held territory. And they had to do it in 72 hours. On paper, it was impossible. Patton made it inevitable. He had anticipated the need. Days before the conference, sensing the scale of the German offensive, he had ordered his staff to prepare 3 contingency plans, dubbed Ajax, Achilles, and Argus, each designed for a rapid pivot north. When Eisenhower asked for 48 hours, Patton was already halfway there. The movement began on the night of December 20th. Under cover of darkness, entire divisions peeled away from the front, their departure masked by artillery barrages and dummy radio traffic. Convoys rolled north through the snow, headlights taped over, engines growling in low gear. MPs stood at every crossroads, directing traffic with flashlights. Engineers cleared ice from bridges. Quartermasters set up fuel dumps along the route. Each one positioned to keep the columns moving without halt. The 4th Armored Division alone moved more than 16,000 vehicles over 150 miles of winter roads in 2 days. It was a feat of coordination unmatched in military history, and it was only possible because of the infrastructure the Americans had built, an infrastructure of radios and trucks and standardized parts, of maps printed by the millions, of a logistics doctrine that treated supply as sacred as firepower. The Germans, by contrast, relied on horses. Nearly 80% of the Wehrmacht's transport was still horse-drawn. Their tanks, magnificent machines though they were, broke down for want of spare parts. Their fuel dumps ran dry. The Americans moved like water, flowing around obstacles, self-correcting, relentless. On December 22nd, the skies cleared. For the first time in nearly a week, the sun broke through the clouds over Bastogne, and the roar of engines filled the air. C-47 transport planes, flying in tight formations, swept low over the encircled town and dropped supplies by parachute. Ammunition, medical kits, plasma, rations. The troopers of the 101st emerged from their foxholes and waved, some cheering, others too exhausted to do more than stare. The Germans watched from the tree line, impotent. Allied fighter bombers followed, P-47 Thunderbolts, screaming down to strafe panzer columns and artillery positions. The psychological shift was immediate. The siege was not over, but the balance had changed. The defenders, cold and hungry and running on fumes, now knew they were not abandoned. And the Germans, who had tasted victory, felt the first cold breath of doubt. Patton's spearhead struck the southern edge of the bulge on the morning of December 22nd. The 4th Armored Division, commanded by Major General Hugh Gaffey, drove north toward Bastogne with the fury of a battering ram. They met fierce resistance. German paratroopers and Volksgrenadier units had fortified the villages along the approach, turning farmhouses into bunkers and roads into kill zones. The fighting was brutal and close. Tanks dueled at ranges measured in meters. Infantry cleared buildings, room by room, with grenades and bayonets. The weather remained savage, temperatures hovering near zero, snow falling in heavy curtains that reduced visibility to a few dozen yards. But the Third Army did not stop. Patton drove his commanders without mercy, appearing at forward positions in his jeep, unmistakable in his polished helmet and riding boots, demanding speed, speed, and more speed. Drive like hell, he told them, and they did. By December 24th, the 4th Armored had covered 30 miles and was within 10 miles of Bastogne. But those final miles were the hardest. The Germans, desperate to hold the encirclement, threw everything they had into the gap. Tiger tanks dug into hull-down positions, picked off Shermans at long range. Entire battalions of infantry counterattacked through the snow. The Americans paid for every yard in blood and burning steel. On Christmas Day, while Allied chaplains held services in frozen fields and soldiers opened care packages from home, the battle raged on. It was not a day of peace. It was a day of killing. The breakthrough came on December 26th. Lieutenant Colonel Craneton Abrams, commanding the 37th Tank Battalion of the 4th Armored, led a column of Shermans and half-tracks up the road from Eisenhower toward Bastogne. They hit a German roadblock, a line of anti-tank guns, and machine gun nests guarding the final approach. Abrams did not slow. He ordered his tanks to charge, firing on the move, crushing obstacles beneath their treads. The half-tracks followed, infantry clinging to the sides, trading fire with German positions as they roared past. It was a knife thrust, sudden and brutal. By late afternoon, Abrams's tanks rolled into the perimeter of Bastogne. The siege was broken. Troopers of the 101st, filthy and gaunt, emerged from their foxholes to shake hands with the tankers. There was no cheering, only a grim, exhausted relief. They had held, and the Third Army had come. Eisenhower's words when he learned of the breakthrough were not recorded in a grand speech or a formal communique. He was not a man given to theatrics. But those who were present at his headquarters on the evening of December 26th recalled a moment of visible relief. A slight relaxation of his shoulders, a brief nod and a quiet remark to his staff. Patton did it. It was a simple acknowledgement, but it carried the weight of recognition. Eisenhower, the architect of coalition warfare, the diplomat who balanced British caution with American aggression, understood what had been accomplished. In 72 hours, Patton had moved an army. In 6 days, he had broken a siege that threatened to unravel the entire Allied campaign in Europe. And he had done it not through brilliance alone, but through the machinery of American logistics, the trucks and radios and fuel dumps, the standardized ammunition and replaceable parts, the vast industrial base that could send 1 million tons of supplies across the Atlantic every month and still have capacity to spare. But there was something else in Eisenhower's response, something unspoken, a recognition that Patton, for all his flaws, his vanity, his recklessness, his hunger for glory, was irreplaceable. Montgomery could plan, Bradley could coordinate, but only Patton could will an army to move faster than anyone thought possible. Only Patton could look at an impossible task and make it inevitable through sheer force of personality. Eisenhower needed that. The Allies needed that. And in the winter of 1944, in the snow-choked forests of Belgium, that singular, ferocious energy had made all the difference. The Germans continued to fight. The Battle of the Bulge would rage for another 3 weeks, grinding through January before the Wehrmacht finally withdrew, shattered and spent. The offensive cost Hitler his last reserves, men and tanks and fuel he could not replace. The Americans lost 19,000 dead and more than 60,000 wounded or captured. But they held, and in holding, they proved something the Germans had not anticipated. That American soldiers, green as they were, could stand and fight under the worst conditions. That American industry, vast and impersonal, could outproduce and outlast the finest war machine Europe had ever built. That the democracy the Germans mocked as weak and decadent could mobilize a fury equal to any tyranny. For the men of the 101st Airborne, the relief of Bastogne became a defining moment. They had been given an impossible task and had accomplished it through cold endurance and stubborn pride. They returned to that encircled town in every story they told, in every reunion they attended, in every quiet moment when they remembered what it had been like to dig a foxhole in frozen ground and wait for the Germans to come again. And they remembered the sound of tank engines on December 26th, the unmistakable rumble of Shermans rolling up the road, and the sight of Lieutenant Colonel Abrams standing in the turret of his tank, waving them over. Relief had not come from the sky or from some distant miracle. It had come from other Americans driving through the snow because someone had told them to, because the job needed doing, because that was what Americans did. Patton himself visited Bastogne on December 30th, driving into the town in his Jeep with flags snapping in the wind. He toured the perimeter, inspected the foxholes, spoke with officers and enlisted men alike. He was, as always, a performance, a mixture of profanity and poetry, of crude jokes and genuine admiration. But the soldiers did not mind. They understood that Patton, whatever else he was, had come for them, that he had driven his army like a man possessed, that he had bullied and cajoled and threatened his way through every obstacle because leaving them surrounded was not an option. And when he left, standing in his Jeep as it pulled away, he turned and saluted. It was a gesture of respect from one fighter to another. The symbolic weight of Bastogne, of the siege and the relief, of McAuliffe's one-word reply, and Patton's forced march resonated far beyond the battlefield. It became a story told in newspapers and newsreels, a parable of American resilience in the face of totalitarian aggression. The frozen foxholes, the airdrops, the tank column driving through enemy fire, all of it fit into a narrative that Americans needed in that dark winter. That they were not invincible, but that they could be relentless. That they did not always win cleanly, but that they did not quit. And that their system, messy and democratic and bound by rules, could generate a kind of power that dictatorships, for all their efficiency, could not match. There was a recurring image in the aftermath of Bastogne, one that soldiers carried with them long after the war. The image of a supply drop, parachutes blossoming over the snow, crates tumbling from the sky, each one packed with the material of survival, ammunition, food, medicine. It was abundance made visible, a tangible expression of the vast machinery behind the front lines. The Germans were starving their and siphoning fuel from abandoned vehicles could not comprehend it. To them, war was scarcity, a zero-sum struggle where every bullet mattered and every gallon of gasoline was hoarded. But the Americans fought from a position of surplus, not because they were inherently richer or more virtuous, but because their system, their sprawling, chaotic entrepreneurial democracy, could produce more, faster, and deliver it to the men who needed it. That was the secret the Germans had failed to grasp. That American strength was not just in courage or firepower, but in the trucks that brought the firepower forward, in the radios that coordinated the trucks, in the factories that built the radios, in the whole, humming, interconnected web of industry and logistics that made modern war possible. For Eisenhower, the relief of Bastogne was validation that his command structure, painstakingly assembled and constantly tested, could respond to crisis with speed and coordination. Validation that men like Patton, difficult and temperamental as they were, had their place in the machine. And validation that the strategy of broad front advance, steady, grinding, relentless pressure across the entire Western Front could withstand even the most desperate German counterstroke. He did not gloat. That was not his nature. But in the months that followed, as the Allies pushed across the Rhine and into the heart of Germany, Eisenhower carried with him the knowledge that the system had worked, that the impossible had been made routine, that when the moment demanded it, the United States could move an army across 100 miles of winter roads in 72 hours and break a siege that should have been unbreakable. The Germans, for their part, drew their own conclusions. In the prisoner cages that filled with captured Wehrmacht soldiers In the weeks after the bulge, interrogators noted a shift in tone. The arrogance of 1940 was gone. The certainty that German discipline and elan could overcome any material disadvantage had crumbled. What remained was a kind of fatalistic recognition that the Americans, whatever their supposed weaknesses, could not be stopped, that they would keep coming in endless waves, supported by endless supplies, until the Reich was ground into dust. One captured officer, asked why Germany continued to fight when defeat was inevitable, gave an answer that summed up the despair of those final months. Because we do not know how to stop. But for the Americans, the lesson of Bastogne was different. It was not about inevitability, but about choice. The choice to fight when surrounded. The choice to drive through a snowstorm to reach men you had never met. The choice to keep moving, keep supplying, keep coordinating, even when the task seemed impossible. That was the machinery of democracy and war. Not a steamroller that crushed through brute force alone, but a system that could adapt, that could learn, that could take punishment and still function. It was messy. It was often inefficient. But when the stakes were highest, it worked. In the spring of 1945, as the Third Army crossed the Rhine and pushed into Bavaria, Patton stood on a bluff overlooking the river and spoke to a group of war correspondents. He did not mention Bastogne by name, but he spoke of movement, of speed, of the necessity of aggression. Wars are not won by defensive tactics, he said. They are won by attacking, by driving forward, by refusing to stop. It was vintage Patton. Bombastic, self-assured, theatrical. But beneath the performance was a truth he had proved in the winter of 1944, that in the end, wars are won by those who can move, by those who can take an impossible order and make it real, by those who can look at a map covered in red pins, marking enemy positions and shattered lines, and see not disaster, but opportunity. Eisenhower never gave Patton the credit publicly that some felt he deserved. He was too conscious of coalition politics, too aware of the egos and rivalries that threatened Allied unity. But in private moments, in letters and memoirs written after the war, he acknowledged what Patton had accomplished, that the relief of Bastogne had been a turning point, that the Third Army's forced march had broken the back of Germany's last great offensive, that in those 6 days in December, one man's relentless drive had saved thousands of lives and secured the road to Berlin. And so the story of Bastogne became a story about many things, about courage and endurance, about logistics and leadership, about the machinery of modern war and the men who made it work. But above all, it became a story about a choice. The choice to act when action seemed impossible. The choice to drive through the snow because men were surrounded and time was running out. The choice to believe that the system, the sprawling, improvised, democratic system, could deliver on its promises. That was what Eisenhower recognized when he learned the siege was broken. Not just that Patton had succeeded, but that the Americans had proved once again that they could do what the enemy thought they could not, that they could take the rules of the possible and rewrite them through sheer determination and organizational will. In the decades after the war, veterans of the 101st Airborne and the 4th Armored Division would gather at reunions and tell the story again. They would argue over details: who arrived first, which road was clearest, whether it was snowing or merely overcast, on the morning of December 26th. But the core of the story never changed, that they had been surrounded, that they had held, that relief had come not as a miracle, but as the result of planning and execution, of men doing their jobs under impossible conditions, of a system that worked because everyone believed it would. And in the end, that was the most American thing about it. Not the heroism, though there was heroism. Not the firepower, though there was firepower. But the stubborn, unglamorous insistence that the job would get done, that the supply lines would hold, that the tanks would roll through the snow, that the promise would be kept. That was the machinery they had built, and that was why they won. December 26th, 1944. The snow falls over Bastogne, softer now, the guns silent for a moment. In a frozen field outside the town, a trooper of the 101st Airborne sits on the edge of his foxhole, heating a can of beans over a small fire. A Sherman tank idles nearby, its engine ticking as it cools. The trooper does not speak. He does not need to. He knows that 20 miles to the south, more tanks are coming. More trucks, more men. An endless column of American might, rolling north through the winter, because that is what they do. He does not think about ideology or freedom or democracy. He thinks about the warmth of the fire and the taste of beans and the knowledge that he is not alone. And that, in the end, is enough.